What's everybody?
Okay, perfect.
Welcome to the Nationals LD topic lecture. That's Chloe. I'm Jonathan. Chloe is doing this from her car at NCFL. So a special shout out to her for making it onto the lecture from the Wendy's parking lot.
Yeah, unfortunately.
But yeah,
Perfect.
so
Um,
go ahead.
okay, I can do the resolution. So the resolution is resolved. In a democracy, a people ought to have the right to secede from their government. And we thought before we get started, we just give you a quick overview on your coaches. So for me, hi, I'm Chloe. I typically do more circuit debate, so I'm providing more perspective on that. I champion Sunvite and Duke, and I've gotten a few bids in other places too.
So yeah, I'm Jonathan. I was last year's NSDA National LD Finalist. Unfortunately, could not get the win on the big stage, but did have a lot of success at last year's tournament, mostly reading traditional philosophical arguments and one round of theory, which we could talk about later. But yeah, excited to be here with you guys, running through the national topics for this upcoming tournament. So with that being said, let's start with some general nationals advice. So Chloe, if you want to take this one away.
Perfect. So for traditionally, there's the better speaker in prelims wins 75% of prelims. It's very good to be a good speaker and to be convincing. Um, and in elims, there are often mixed panels. I'm going to go over the flow and tech versions, and Jonathan's going to go over the lay versions. But to start with flow and tech, so the difference between flow and tech, or another word for tech is circuit judge, is that circuit judges will usually evaluate things like theory, Ks, etc. And flow judges do flow, but they're way better with policy type arguments and won't really know how to evaluate a very technical round of something like theory or something like a K. It's unlikely to get a majority circuit panel, but you are more likely to get a majority flow panel, especially in elims. And in this case, it's just better to if you get a majority flow panel, it's better to not worry about how you sound as much and more focus on winning technically on the flow. Flow judges are also more likely than lay judges to buy unintuitive arguments like extinction. If you read an extinction impact in front of a lay judge, they'll usually just sort of disregard it or just don't or won't buy it. But if you read it in front of the right flow judge, they usually will buy it. It's very unlikely to have a majority circuit panel, but it is possible. And in these rounds, sometimes they will get mad if you read circuit arguments or spread against a lay kid. So you should make sure that you should ask their preferences before the round. But in this case, just yeah, you can read extinction impacts or read theory or anything unintuitive as long as they're fine with it. So for the general structure, for the AF, you can read depending on how flow or tech the judge is, three contentions. You can stretch the one and C, and just make it very technical. You can add extinction impacts to the app sometimes. You can read more contentions than you would usually. You could go a bit faster. For the negative, you could read a couple of disadvantages or contentions with the built-in defense that you can go for, but also offensive arguments. And you should try to keep the case material independent of the value structure. It's a really arbitrary adjudication, but you still should do it. And for when you're in the negative, you should also probably try to separate the case, make the case arguments about the app case, separate from your decides and your contentions. You can do this in lay rounds too. It's often very good, but just make sure that you clearly delineate what is what.
Yeah, for sure. And especially, I think what tends to get people in a lot of those rounds where you have like the mixed panels, you're not sure what to do, or even in some lay rounds, is that like the 1AR is like universally recognized as the most difficult speech in LD because you're dealing with 7 minutes in 4 minutes. And so that's why, we tend to say like if you are going to go down the route of having a more technical AF, then it's not a bad idea. Like to stretch it out, give the NR a lot to work with. That way you don't have to worry about having 10 responses on like the thesis of your case. You can make decisions, drop arguments the same way you would in a regular tech round. But so for lay and trad judges, depending on the kind of debater you are, you're either very familiar with this or not familiar with it at all. In either scenario, if you're very familiar with it, then the same things that are true at your local tournaments are true here. You want to create a cohesive narrative. Couple like tricks and tips, just having the clever contention names that you see in public forum a lot. So like, the house is on fire, we need to put it out or whatever. Instead of just saying like the situation is dire or whatever. And then using analogies, I found that that was probably my most helpful tool at nationals last year, was just having like a toolbox of analogies that I could pick from and use in different places, to make the round either more digestible for the judge or to make me out to be a funnier or more interesting person than I actually am. Using analogies just like adds an extra layer of understanding, I think, on your part, like demonstratively, and also on their part, like literally as they're trying to process what could be kind of a complicated round. And the second thing is you're getting scored on style. So if you're not usually debating these layer trad rounds, it's very, very easy to slip into a style where vocal crutches, slip ups, anything that has to do with the way that you speak becomes kind of unimportant. So if you're someone who doesn't care about speaker points in the traditional sense, I would suggest abandoning that and improving your ability, like as an orator, right? Becoming a better orator, becoming an enact, because traditional LD shares a lot of its speaking style with some of the events that are like pretty distant from it, right? So like someone who's good at Congress could totally have success in traditional LD, because it's a lot of it is about the way that you sound. So don't abandon that the way that you would at a lot of circuit tournaments. And the most helpful thing for me was that I had probably 5 to 10 blocks like total on both sides that I was using every round and almost exclusively using those blocks. So some universal responses that you can get comfortable with and used to improve your style points. Because as you're reading, like you're referencing carded evidence in a rebuttal, and you're doing that off the dome, like that's really impressive across the judging spectrum. So definitely, make sure that you're finding the ones that work for you and then using them over and over and over. But yeah, so let's start. We can break the resolution down. Chloe, if you want to take the first one.
But yeah, so there's a couple of different terms in the resolution which have sort of not even just ambiguous meanings, but meanings that can have multiple different definitions. So the clearest definition for all these you've written down, the a people refers to the men, women, and children of a particular nation, community, or ethnic group. So that can pretty much just mean anything. A people probably isn't a super contestable term, but it's interesting that they use the article a instead of the. But yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And I think like the where that term might come to a clash with on different sides, is discussing the size of a people. Like, can a group of 10 be a people that has a right to secede? But yeah, the most important word in the resolution, I think, and in a lot of resolutions that have this word in it, is right. So two kind of interpretations that I think will be like generally accepted. So it's going to be one or the other. And if your case is hinged on one of them, then make sure you're prepared to beat the other. But the first is protected like by government or international law, an ability to cede. Kind of like what we see in Canada, right? Where there's like a a literal like governmental like right to secede. Like it's baked into the Constitution that there are certain like conditions that can be met where secession is appropriate, or international law where the UN just like passes some resolution, and that's dealing with more of the implementation level, or is it on the virtuous level where we're talking about like an inherent and unimpeachable allowance to secede?
So for the word secede itself, this usually means officially reject the authority of a ruling government, likely followed by the establishment of a new government, although it doesn't always have to be. There's different sort of questions about what may follow from the result of a secession, whether that be a completely new form of democracy, an autocracy, an authoritarian, an authoritarian system, or just a form of anarchy or anything else. Secede, the process of secession might also be different. There could be legal avenues that do that. It could just be pretty much just a document that says we secede, or it could be a fight. It could be a lot of different things. So that term is kind of contested.
Yeah, and then for democracy, it's like a government where citizens vote for elected representatives, or if you want to take it a step further, where they vote like directly on policy. And so far as people are voting and the government is listening, I think it's a democracy. So a couple of the big stuck points with the framing. So the big one, and the one that I think is almost always true with nationals topics, is whether this debate is happening on a practical level or like a virtuous ideological level. In this case, it's a question of whether or not it's a policy action or a conceptual question. So are we saying, like, is the AF saying that there should be some like abstract, like in a vacuum, there is a right for the people who are not satisfied with the democratic government to secede from it? Or are we dealing with a question of like, hey, let's look at the global hotspots where secession is likely or even possible and talk about what happens when there's a secession, right? Like, would it be good or bad if there was a secession in Catalonia? And that's where like we did a little like Catalan AF versus government legitimacy. You're probably going to have one of those rounds in either strategy where you're hitting an opponent who's approached the resolution in a completely different way from you. So I think it might even be a good idea to come up with some reasons as to why it's good that we debate on a practical level, or it's good that we debate on a philosophical, moral, virtuous, whatever words you choose level.
Okay, great. So the word secede, there's a question about whether the new government has to be in the works or established, or if people are allowed to just live in anarchy in the world of secession. So it would just be a question about what that looks like and what it would look like to create an entirely new, and if it would be an entirely new country or region, or just what the legal classification for that would be. But yeah, the question, moral and legal questions about what sort of government would follow would be very important.
Yeah, and then the last one is democracy. So I think it's going to become a question of does the democratic government have to be legitimate at the time of secession for it to fall under the resolution? So if the democratic government starts failing to do its job, i.e., like elections are rigged, like if elections are rigged, is it still topical for the AF to say like, hey, if elections are rigged, people should be able to secede? Because is that even a democratic government? And that's maybe a little bit out on the margins, but it's just something to keep in mind as you're like constructing your AF. Like, make sure that the hypotheticals that you're putting forth to determine whether or not it's acceptable for secession to happen are like certainly within the confines of the resolution, because that's like a silly way to lose ground. Cool. So we'll start with three case ideas for the AF. So first, Chloe, if you want to take it away with the general notes values.
Yeah, so there's just a couple of values that we put down that we thought would be good on the affirmative as opposed to the negative. First one being autonomy. People should have the right to be able to do what they want, and if they're not satisfied with their government, then they should be able to leave and just form a new one. Second one is freedom. Freedom is obviously you can make arguments like Kantian arguments that's intrinsically good. And the third one is democracy. This is more matters down below, like in the slideshow where we talk about bargaining power and how it's good for people to be able to have bargaining power to use in their democracy. Oh, and Quinn, we'll take questions at the end. We'll do like 15 minutes for questions. Okay, yeah. So
Yeah.
for the first half, Jonathan, if you want to start.
Yes. There we go. Yeah. So for the first half about like autonomy and self-determination, you can take this in a bunch of different directions. So like autonomy, democracy, freedom, like all three of the listed values could function in some different way here. Choose to prioritize the ability of people to like, like self-determine, strengthen democracy because like the will of the people is being respected probably in a seceded state. Or freedom because just like more options is always more freedom. So again, you can plug and play and reframe the round in whatever way you'd like. You going this direction. And I think just like one thing to keep note of, something that you see a lot of in tech rounds, but definitely has its place in lay rounds, and especially in this resolution, is like a reproduction of colonial dynamics. So I think talking explicitly about Scotland and Catalonia, because they are like Scotland is literally an extension of a colonial empire, and Catalonia is looking a lot like one. That it's just a good idea to like make reference to those things, draw those comparisons, and like explain why it's bad.
And for the more philosophically driven view of this autonomy self-determination act, the argument could be that it's intrinsically good for people to have freedom and autonomy. And you could potentially argue that the government's not allowing the right to succeed is a form of coercion. That's a Kantian perspective, which I did find some evidence for, but I wasn't really able to cut. But there's a lot of questions that about rights, etc., which Kant talks a lot about. Um, so yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And just like as an extra note, like this is basically what I did last year for my AF. Um, just because like in terms of lay value structures, there's a handful of things that I think are safe to pull from, and so I tend to pull from Kant a lot. And I use like freedom, and I said like people have a a freedom to knowledge, or they're in order to be free, you must have access to all the knowledge or whatever. For the AF last year, and that's why leaking is a good thing. So it's not the worst thing in the world to spend some time and draw those connections in order to make yourself understandable. Which brings us to the pros and cons of autonomy. Um, yeah, so the first thing is the pro on the pro side, right? Like you get a really clear narrative. Um, Again, it's whatever direction you choose, it's easy for it to be 6 minutes of a cohesive story, which is a really good thing. It's also very much moral or philosophical. And the good thing about that is that it can come before some of the compelling util consequential snags. Um, but even more is it's like really appealing to the judges who aren't really sure what to do with the round. Because if I'm listening to a round and I hear one person who sounds like they have a more fleshed out understanding of philosophy, and I, as a new judge, have been told that I'm judging a philosophical debate, that's suddenly the more compelling person, right? Or that's at the very least like the tiebreaker. And it's also uniquely compatible with the word democracy in the resolution, because if people are not autonomous rational agents, then there can be no reasonable democracy. As for the cons, it's pretty broad. I think if you do it wrong, you're going to end up speaking into a void, kind of. And then more specific nags might get you beat with like 70% of judges. And that's something to keep in mind is you want to know that like your case material is good for more than half of the judging pool, especially as you move into elims and you're getting those mixed panels. The other thing too is like we talked about, for this to be a winning argument, you have to do one of two things. And those are the two cons. Is that you either have to do a lot of moral legwork, so you're probably spending 2 minutes setting up the round and framing it. That way, your material that doesn't have maybe huge impact is still really compelling under your value structure, um, which can leave you less time to win the game of example tennis that's going to be happening in basically every one of these rounds. And then that's the second thing. Like the alternative strategy is like, let's say you spend a little bit less time on building up your value structure, then your case material can't be hinged, or at least not all of it can be hinged on that value structure. Because if it goes, then you go. And it's probably bad to put all your eggs in one basket unless you're very sure about the strength of that basket. And then yeah, so for the util aff, I think that nobody should read this, just to be super clear. Um, but if you are dead set on reading util, then here are some of the options. And these are also just good things to know. Um, but yeah, like the util, just broadly speaking, util is probably not your best strategy coming into the tournament, um, because you literally might not make it out of prelims, even as a great debater, if you're just reading exclusively util, because it's like other philosophical approaches are so much more compelling, and util is like so basic, so boring, and also amongst certain traditional lay judges could be associated with a type of debate that they don't like, right? So when you get that traditional coach from Texas in your round and they hear you talking about util, it's like, oh, it's all those damn tech kids, like all those damn circuit debaters or whatever. So just make sure you're being cautious of this. But again, if you are dead set on running it, it's not the worst thing in the world. Um, Catalonia, like these are the three examples that I'd pick from, and you could set them up as independent advantages if you wanted to. That'd probably be the best strategy. um, is for Catalonia to say like listen, Catalonia is proposing a new economic model if they do secede, and that model involves increased trade with a lot of countries in the EU. Not only is that good for those countries, but also good for the United States. Like it just seems like if Catalonia were to secede, in order to make their secession more compelling to support for like other countries in the world, or yeah, like in order to garner support from other countries, Catalonia has set up their new economic model to be really conducive to other countries' success. So there's probably lots of trade advantages that you could mine. And then also like we know 100% that Catalonia will have like a really strong GDP. Their economy will be in a good place. So there's probably advantages in terms of like labor force, wages, quality of life in Catalonia, potentially in Spain. But I wouldn't bank on that. And then for Texas, this is my least favorite thing. but like it's in the briefs, and they have some like decent evidence for it. They say that Texas seceding sets a standard of non-intervention, basically because it shows the United States government that Texas makes up a decent portion of people who serve in the military. It has lots of money, and like they're an important state. And so if they secede, it teaches us like we need to be more cautious about our federal government spending. Don't find that too compelling. And then the cost of higher education argument, I just think that's like not true. Um, but it is again, there's some evidence for it that higher education in Texas would be cheaper if they pulled out of the federal government. The most compelling thing, if you are going to go with this approach, is probably Scotland, because I think it's very directly like immediately you get utilitarian benefits with Scotland. Like if Scotland gets to secede, because British action and like the British repression of Scottish opinions literally directly correlated with Scottish economy declining, people losing lots of money, a decrease in their GDP, and like a buildup of conflicts in Scotland. And we also know that like since like Margaret Thatcher era, the UK has been I don't have a way of putting it besides like stealing from Scotland, right? Like Scotland is making money off trade, and then the UK is taxing it at like a ridiculous level. And so that probably leads to like huge GDP boosts and just like economic independence of Scotland, and that's where you get most of your utilitarian benefit, I'd say. And Chloe, if you want to take this one.
Yeah, definitely. So the pros of this app, first of all, is that it's pretty straightforward. There's a lot of good examples because it's based in a lot of empirics for these individual countries. Secondly, is impacts. This can very easily be leveraged against a philosophical negative that says, oh, it's just immoral to do this, but they don't really have a solid impact of people dying, for example, or GDP or something like that. So it's very convincing in front of a lot of judges to just be like our impacts outweigh theirs. And you can usually get that with this AF. Third one is that policy judges will usually eat it up. They'll really like to see an AF like this as opposed to an AF that's very philosophical. For the cons, is that it does lock you into a losing game of example tennis because, for example, if you give an example of um, Texas independence being good and then they give an example of it being bad, and then it just goes into sort of an unwinnable back and forth about examples. Secondly, is that it's philosophically lazy and sometimes can run into a lot of like independent voters or in lay rounds they'll just be someone saying that utilitarianism can cause oppression because util inevitably takes into account the greatest number of people and kind of disregards a minority, which would mean that a lot of times the minority is just not getting any sort of benefit from it as long as it helps the majority. So that can be an argument that someone might make against utilitarianism. Thirdly, is that trial judges will sometimes hate it. They it's just sometimes too technical for them. And it's not based in morals as much. So someone might just say, "Oh, you say that being happy is good, being sad is bad, but where's the morality in that?" This is sort of a little bit more complicated than lay debate goes into it, but the Izok gap is sort of an example that I like to bring up, which is that there's no way to derive an ought from descriptive premises, so they might just say you can say that being happy is good, but there's no link from being happy to being good. It just because something makes you happy does not mean that it's good. So yeah.
100%. But yeah, okay. This is my favorite AF. And the one that I think will be like deep in Elam rounds. So this one says basically that secession in the toolbox creates a stronger, more legitimate check back against oppression. Couple examples that I think you could lean on really heavily, just like true examples. The first is Quebec in Canada and the Clarity Act. So if you're not familiar with it, Quebec in like 95 to 97 started to threaten to secede from Canada because of language barriers, lack of economic opportunity, and just like they felt like their French speaking population was being heavily discriminated against. So they wanted out. And the Canadian government responded by like bolstering economic opportunity in those areas, and aiding like Quebec in like developing. And they created what's called the Clarity Act, which is the thing that's listed, which is like creates a system and lays out conditions wherein like if the Canadian government doesn't meet like X, Y, and Z, then Quebec has the ability to secede again. Like they have the Canadian assured right to secede. So not only did the threat of secession lead to positive change for the group that threatened to secede, but it also created a pathway for them to secede in the future if those aren't met. So there's like huge accountability benefits on the part of the big government in this scenario. But the other one, and the clearer one, in my opinion, is Scotland again. Expect Scotland to come up a ton at this topic. But the Blair devolution. So around a similar time, like in the 95-ish, Scotland was super dissatisfied with the UK, like like just centralized power. We feel like our voices aren't being heard, and we're going to secede. And the UK responded by like divesting some of that power and just like what's called the Blair devolution, where they like rescinded a number of their powers and gave them to Scottish leaders. And that led to the formation of the Scottish Parliament in 1999, which is like the first independent, nationally recognized Scottish government. So like ultimately Scotland threatening to secede from that bigger part of the government led to them getting like some form of independence, having a channel by which their voices could be heard, and getting increased power. And the pros and cons for this one, the reason why I think it'll be so successful is because of the first pro, which is that you get no link turns. So what I think a smart negative will do is make the debate about whether or not the process of secession is good or bad. And I think the negative would be right to say that a secession would be bloody, dangerous, and hurt everybody involved. And so if your impacts trigger before we even get to the point of secession, suddenly you're avoiding all of those negative things. So in the same way, right, in policy, if you read a certain type of affirmative, then certain disadvantages don't link into it. A lot of those negatives are going to be dependent on the AF being written a certain way. And if you can write your AF in this way, that's the second thing, right, about it being unique. If you can write an AF like this, that's different from the stock AF, you get to avoid a lot of those things and potentially kill like all or most of the negative offense in the round in your 1AC. And the last thing is that it's super versatile. Any type of debater can engage with it, and it can be used against. It can win against any type of neg, but mostly the first one, which is that like no matter what your debate background is, I think this argument is intuitive enough to where like if you're a lay debater who wants to approach things from a very like I'm giving a speech way, you can totally do that. But if you are a tech debater, then you get to get into like the hyper specifics of what's going on in Scotland, and what went on in Quebec. Like I think that gives you a lot of avenues to still be very policy oriented if that's what you choose to do. The cons are that like we're going to go over a neg that basically says this in the next part, but a neg that says like you say they respond with a positive action. Here's a bunch of examples where they responded by going to war, and that could be kind of bad for you. A little squirrely. It might be like this argument might be a little bit like you might be running towards the middle a little, if you were to read this argument. And so maybe I'd caution against that portion of it. Just make sure that as you're doing this, like you're still strongly affirming because language like, well, we, agree with everything the negative says, except for this one part, like can be sort of problematic in some rounds where they're evaluating big ideas more than like the, hyper niche aspects of the round. But I think that can be avoided with like rhetoric almost entirely. And then the last thing is that here's like the downside. If you are someone who treats LD like giving 2 or 3 speeches, is that you don't get your big impact moment, right? Like there's nothing about this that just like is a showstopper. All the impacts are very true, but not massive in magnitude. Chloe, I'll let you
So
take it away.
okay, perfect. So for the neg ideas, for some general notes, for the values, we thought that the value of governmental legitimacy is a good value. Or yeah, governmental legitimacy is a good value because obviously, if the government is giving power to those who secede, or just letting them secede to begin with, that takes away some legitimacy from the government because the government just doesn't have as many people to rule over, and then people are less sort of confident in the government's ability. Next is stability. Oftentimes, secession can happen through either violent means or unstable means. It can lead to more instability within the country because there's competing factions, etc. This is all just more of an offense level, but we'll just talk more about that later on in the negative slides. Third one is democracy, because some might argue that seceding could lead to less democracy because in the places where they've seceded, that could be taken over by either anarchy or an autocracy, authoritarianism, etc., which means that there's not going to be as much democracy. And you'd argue that democracy is intrinsically good. So for some observations, the word right is a very strong word. So you could definitely find a definition of rights that say that rights are unconditional, which means that they hold regardless of the time or place, which would mean that there's no circumstances in which this would not be a right, which is a very hard burden for the AF to prove. So that would make things a bit easier on the negative. There's also a question of positive rights versus negative rights, which isn't really a consideration here, but probably just an observation that you could read. And then for the first negative idea, we thought that so the first negative idea was Hobbes. This is sometimes a little bit unintuitive for some parents because you pretty much say that the state should have unrestricted power, except for in some instances, which I'll explain later. But for the framework itself, the firstly is that the sovereign should get to do whatever they want, otherwise ethics should collapse. Two important key factors here are the first one being relativism, means that different people have different conceptions of ethics. So if I personally am a utilitarian and Johnathan is a Kantian, then that would mean that our ethics are coming into sort of conflict with each other. And the only way to be able to preserve that is through a higher ability that makes sure that we're both able to have our own ethical calculus. Secondly is the state of nature. There's arguments about how the state of nature causes infinite violence, so we need something like a sovereign to be able to protect against the state of nature, because in the state of nature, everyone is for themselves and they're killing each other and might make us right, so it's obviously just a very bad place to live. So in this case, the sovereign is the democratic government. This might not always be true. For example, in authoritarian regimes, the sovereign might be the authoritarian, but since the actor in the resolution is the democratic governments, then that means that for this resolution, the sovereign are the democratic governments that we're talking about. So, different variations of Hobbes say different things. There is an argument that Hobbes leads to oppression because the sovereign can do whatever they want to, but they're not supposed to infringe on certain rights. For example, if the world of the sovereign is worse than the state of nature, obviously you wouldn't want to have that. So basically, yeah, they have to protect people's basic rights and prevent the state of nature. And Hobbes, for the offense, negates because no one should be allowed to secede from the government. There's questions about whether it actually negates or not, which I'll explain on the next slide. If we can go to the next slide real quick. So I'll explain this here. So for the pros, it's pretty straightforward, the framework, which is basically just that it's good to have like a government to be able to protect against people hurting each other. It's arguable ground, which is also a con because, and this is what I was explaining before, because if the sovereign doesn't respect the basic rights of the people, then people are technically allowed to form their own communities because the sovereign is not doing their job of preventing things like the state of nature. Which means that if you find an example of a democracy where bad things are happening, and the sovereign is not sort of respecting things, then that would mean that it would be better for people to form their own communities. In a democracy, you could argue that this does not happen because people have the ability to vote and democracies lead to good things, and more oppression happens in authoritarian regimes. But that is the question about whether the ground is for the alpha for the negative. I would say that it's probably for the negative, but there are arguments about how it is for the affirmative. The third pro is that it's really good for argument or for judges who like philosophy. It's very hard to beat with utilitarianism if you're in front of a judge who likes philosophy. For the cons is that it also does lock you into a losing game of example tennis because you can go back and forth. This government is good, this government is bad, this government doesn't respect rights. And then it just sort of leads to sort of just a losing game of example tennis. For the next one is the oppression argument. I sort of explained that before, but some people might say that Hobbes justifies the sovereign doing whatever they want to. Again, this is not true because they have to respect some basic rights. And the third one is that it's sometimes unintuitive. If you're in front of a parent judge saying that the government should be able to sort of do what they want and not have people secede from them is a bit unintuitive because it's just sort of making an argument about ethics, and sometimes judges will buy consequentialist or utilitarian impacts over that.
Yeah, so the next neg, and this one is sort of like the flip side of the third AF, about like having secession as a tool. So to beat that AF, right, and also just broadly speaking, I think this is a really good neg. And it basically just says like look, if we can always walk away from the government, why should we ever work on improving it, right? Like if you're someone who's discontent with the way that the government is working, why are you going to, like try to resolve that with the ruling power or the group that has more power than you, when instead you could walk away? And so I think the first thing that you need to note in the link story, like as you're putting this argument together, is you need to be really convincing on the idea that like there are natural checks in the democracy and they work. So like Black Lives Matter protests led to the George Floyd Act or whatever works for you, there's like literally thousands of examples, right? But just like protests lead to policy action, and democracy in and of itself checks back against discontent, right? So we get to vote out people who do things that we don't agree with. So the will of the people is always in movement. But what you're going to say, right, is you're going to do a little bit of a world comparison here, where you say, like, right now, like, okay, yeah, maybe lots of people go unheard. There's some amount of dissent from majority opinion in government. But the alternative is if every major like disagreement within the government or within two political parties, there were if in all those scenarios there were talks of secession, then the government would never be able to work. Because political leaders, both for the sake of political capital and for like coming from a legitimate point like standpoint, are talking about seceding from the group they don't agree with, right? So there's just like less interest in coming to the table, or less of an incentive to, and increased antagonization, where basically you say, right, just as an example, like look, the Democrats have the majority in the House, the Senate, and the presidency or whatever. We as the Republicans are like not interested in working with them anymore because we don't have to be one big entity. Instead, we can just split off and do it our own way, which can lead into some authoritarian slip slide, right? And then to me, the biggest impact here, like if that's what's important to you, is what the world would look like after a secession, right? So even if we assume that secession is peaceful, like give the AF the highest ground, secession works out, and we now have two independent states. Again, looking to the United States, let's say the South secedes, right? What you now have is a group of people who lived in the South under the condition that the federal government would protect them in some instances, that now have no federal government to protect them, right? And so any group that's generally marginalized in South, right? We're talking about LGBTQ people, women, maybe people of color, right? Like where you just there's now a dangerous situation and a ruling government that has no checkbacks from people that are being represented by those populations. So the 30% of Democrats or whatever that like live in Mississippi are now having borderline no representation in their state, right? Or they're disproportionately underrepresented. So just ask questions about what it looks like in a world where we start splitting up people according to their belief systems, as opposed to having like a balanced democracy. Yeah, and then the pros and cons of this argument are straightforward. Same thing, like it has a clear narrative. Just don't rock the boat. It's there's truth to it. I think political leaders would totally make use of secession as a tool, right? Like anytime there was a disagreement. Um, like in the same way, right, that like Mitch McConnell sent out that tweet, like, here's what we're gonna do. If you guys disband the filibuster, and it's like a list of 40 things that the Republican government would do if the Democrats took a policy action that they didn't like. Now imagine that he had access to secession as one of those tools, right? Like I think it would definitely be leveraged a lot, especially in a polarized country and world. And I think the impacts like at the bottom half are compelling. Like if you really want to extend it, you could do that effectively. The cons that you have to say government is good, which could be bad for all kinds of judges, um, across both like the political spectrum and debate spectrum. But I think you can get over that insofar as you're not being a government truther, and you're just saying like, yeah, like maybe organized governments in many cases aren't great, um, but they're better than this, right? Or even look back to Hobbes, like they're better than the state of nature. The bad thing is I think this is going to be a really popular argument, so expect it to be prepped out. It's not necessarily bad. It's just like if you're going to do it, make sure you're doing it well because people are going to have answers. So don't do this halfway because there are probably some really good stock answers to beat it. And then the impacts are a little bit non-unique. Like I said, like if the impact that you're bringing to the table is that people are like antagonizing their counterparts in the government. Like that happens basically everywhere in the world. So you just have to do a little bit more legwork on the impact level in order to not get non-yeeked out of the round.
Okay, so for some general arguments, first on counterplans, first of all, these are probably better in rounds with flow or tech judges because a lot of lay judges probably won't buy these. But the first one is communal autonomy, which is basically just makes arguments that you're able to solve for the negative things about democracy, by just having sort of small communities that have their own rules, and you can sort of think about like Native American reservations or something like that as sort of some sort of example of like an argument like this, which is just that people should be able to have their own communities, but still be under the United States law, but still be able to like make their own laws in some instances, stuff like that. Power sharing is very similar. Basically just that you share power with the government, but there will be different ways of doing that. And through different avenues. There's also a lot of other counterplans that just make arguments about how we should ensure that X group gets representation, which solves this part of the AF. But again, this isn't probably an argument that you'll encounter too much, especially in lay settings, because there's just not usually a lot of counterplans in lay. And Jonathan, if you want to go through the dishats.
But you can take the border one first because I think you're more
Okay.
familiar with.
So for the border dishat, the argument or dishat or contention, the argument is that there's not solidly defined borders in the instances of secession. So if someone were to secede, then or like if a group were to want to secede, then there'd be questions about how much land they would get, which borders they would be able to take. There's obviously solidly defined state borders, but if you were going sort of deeper than that, then there'd be questions about what borders you'd get and just questions of also protecting your borders as well. Um, and yeah, there's obviously a lot of issues that come with making new borders, which I'm sure could be talked about for a long time.
Yeah, and then for the backlash one, it sort of comes from a similar place as a stability one. And again, sort of responsive to that third F idea, right? Where you say like, as opposed to viewing it from the perspective of the government, this time you're viewing it from the perspective of the people who are trying to secede, where you basically say like yeah, maybe the government hears our calls for secession, and responds with negotiation, but maybe they respond with violence, and that's where you like start to get into. So in Scotland and Catalonia, in both of those instances, I think Catalonia is probably the better example, where Spain like literally militarized the region like immediately, and killed a bunch of Catalonian leaders, right? So Catalonia says we're going to secede, Spain retaliates hugely. Sudan, right? South Sudan is like, we're going to peacefully secede and we ask nothing of the North. And the North launches a full scale, extremely devastating war. And then similarly, the Confederacy says we're going to secede and the Union goes to war, right? And that's just like a set of examples that I think are really straightforward and easy to understand, where it was not an instant like secession was necessarily non-peaceful because the ruling power wouldn't allow it to be. So that's the backlash DA, right? Is that they're just gonna like you secede, they're gonna punish you for even talking about it. And then Chloe, if you want to take the oppression one.
Yeah, definitely. So for the oppression dissent, there's obviously a couple different facets of oppression that might happen if there was a result of secession. The first one might be just ethnic, religious, etc. conflicts, especially in the area in which people seceded. There could obviously be oppression of certain people. For example, obviously, Jonathan talked about this a little bit before, but in the South, for example, people of color, if they are in a sort of certain southern area, then there might not be official federal legal checks checking violence against them, which would mean that there'd be a lot of oppression there. There would also be sort of questions about who would be allowed in these areas, etc., which could just end up creating more questions about oppression. So for the pros and cons, so the first one is that it's solid examples and pretty straightforward. This is sort of the same as the other util AC. It's arguable ground, so it works on both the affirmative and the negative. It's very good for policy judges. The cons are that it can often lock you into a losing game of example tennis where you're just giving counter examples. It's especially on the negative, it's a little bit complicated, especially the counter plans. Some of the disodds are pretty easy and intuitive to understand, but sometimes it can get complicated, especially if you're adding more terminal impacts and also just sometimes unintuitive. Like, for example, if you're reading an extinction impact, it seems unintuitive that allowing secession could lead to extinction or a lot of these other big impacts. So now we are open for cross-ex or any questions that anyone would have. So if there's, I know that there's one in the chat right now, we'll take those. If anyone wants to put more in the chat or just unmute, we'd be fine to answer any of those. So I think, Johnathan, you should take the first one since it's more in your area of knowledge.
Yeah, let me look at it right now. Could example of legitimacy be like Ethiopia being in the process of becoming a true democracy in Eritrea? So Ethiopia is a little bit of a complicated example, I would say, and not necessarily a bad thing, right? Like it's good to have that extra level of nuance, but Italy has had their hand in that region for like a really long time, right? So well after Ethiopia was like on track to become a democracy, Italy was still interfering with the relations, which is part of the reason that Eritrea was upset, right? Like that was where some of the frustrations were coming from, was because they felt like that colonialism that had originally like, for lack of a better word, like pissed them off so much, like was still ongoing. Um, but yeah, like I think for legitimacy, like when you're asking about legitimacy, Quinn, if you want to like unmute and explain, like, were you asking about the af or the neg here? Like if you just give me a little bit more of an example, like for what do you mean by an example of legitimacy?
Um, well, you were saying that I'll pull up the screenshot, but what I was trying to get at was using it as an example of it losing democracy because Eritrea is now authoritative, right?
I got you.
So, so that was my point in using it. Do you think that would be okay? Or
Yeah, that's a really good tool, maybe of even for the neg, right? To say like, and that's part of the thing where we talked about the like the definitions, the way they might get contested. I think it would be a good thing to say like, we don't know what happens in a government that secedes from a democracy, and actually, it's probably more likely than not that their secession is united by some strong ideological push, and that means that like it for the most part it probably looks authoritarian, and then leaning on that as an example. So yeah, I think you definitely make good use of that
thank you.
for sure. Chloe, you want to take the next one?
Yeah, definitely. So, okay, the question was, do you think a two-pronged case of both practical impacts and principal or ideological strategic, or should we stick more towards one? So it really depends on the case. I would say that generally you should stick more towards one. If you're going to be defending a more philosophical argument, then you should go pretty hard on that. And if you're defending a more policy argument, then you should go pretty hard on that. But they can sometimes be mixed, especially with the value criterion. Like you could use the value of freedom and link a bunch of utilitarian impacts under that, because freedom is what's intrinsically or what causes more pain rather than pleasure. So they can both happen. I personally think that it's strategic to stick towards one, but it's oftentimes good to have consequentialist impacts that also impact out under utilitarianism, under an AF like or under a neg like a Hobbes neg or something like that. You would ultimately make the argument that it would make people happier to do the negative than it would to make them, or than it would make them sad. So I think that um pick one or the other, but if you're using more like principled or ideological standpoint, you can also just add like more practical impacts to the end of it to make it sound better.
Yeah, I think that was I totally agree. Like that was totally the strategy that I went with last year, was a lot of like everything started from a philosophical jump point, but there's an integration of a lot of real world examples, because I think like probably one of the most common cross-ex questions in every traditional LD round ever is like, has this ever happened? Like, can you provide any examples for this? And so being able to, clap back and be like, yeah, it happened here, 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 and here. It's really rhetorically powerful, and it's also like a great way to legitimize your case. So I think like it's definitely possible to balance them. But I wouldn't do half and half, right? Like don't start as if you're gonna frame the round in a really philosophical way, and then read like Scotland Advantage or whatever, right? So make sure you're having a consistent style the whole time, but it's definitely possible to integrate both. And okay, the next question I see in here is, can you balance backlash to war with checks on democracy, or do you have to pick one? uh, Probably better just to pick one, I think. um because like you're trying to create a narrative about whether or not the government works. So if you want the government to be evil, then the whole thing should be saying the government's evil. And if you don't want it to be evil, then don't say it's evil, you know? Chloe, you can take the next one.
I think you should probably take the next one because I don't understand the policy stuff as much.
Okay. Taylor, do you want to unmute and explain a little bit what you mean?
I got you. So, what I was asking there is that you said for the second neg, which was talking about basically the stability one, and it's split into extremist factions, and then one of the weaknesses you stated that it would go into a war of antagonization. Irredentism, I'm kind of familiar with how it's just like, say for how you brought up civil war in the United States. South seceded, and then the Union didn't recognize the South secession as legitimate, so then they attacked. So do you think the antagonization of the extremist factions, if this right were to be given, could be linked to that irredentism impact?
Yeah, okay, yeah, most certainly. So I think like, and that's a really good way of putting it. I think like there's a couple impact levels, and I think the non-uniqueness problem occurs at the first one when you're talking about like while the government is still all together, you're having that lack of a willingness to come together. But like, yeah, for sure. Like once the secession happens, like, and we're talking about, Spain trying to annex Catalonia or whatever, and like retake them. Like, yeah, you get more violence for sure. I don't even know if you need to link those things or if you could just like set them up as independent impacts. Probably be better
Awesome, thanks.
for sure. Chloe, you want to take Aaron's question?
Yeah, perfect. So the question was thoughts on making several disades you can pick and choose from to read on different apps and adapt versus having one present for neg on the lay and case page after both. So I personally tend to switch my negs every single round, especially in circuit rounds, but even in lay rounds too. If the negative or if the affirmative is something specific, I'd read specific lay negative contentions that respond specifically to the affirmative. I think that there's a couple benefits of this. The first one being that it's a lot easier to not get prepped out if you're reading a lot of different neg contentions, um, as opposed to just reading one. Secondly, I think that you can cater it towards the judge. I think that it's important to look up your judge. I like to look up my judge before the round and just see their political, ideological leanings, etc., and just cater the arguments more towards that. I think that there's panels here, so I don't know how well that would work, but there's also some cons to doing that. Like you'd need a lot more prep if you're not reading the same case every single round. But yeah, personally, I think that changing your negative based on the affirmative is a really good idea, especially for nationals where you might be getting prepped out.
Yeah, I think for me that wasn't something that I did. Mostly I would say because of a prep barrier. Not barrier, but just like it would have taken a lot of work to have a lot of those independent like arguments that I can switch around. And the good thing about nationals, it's a little bit different from the circuit tournaments where like you can get prepped out. Like if you're 4-0 and you go home that night, you're coming back the next morning getting prepped out. But at nationals, nobody can know your record in prelims, first of all, but also nobody can know who you are because you all have speaker codes. So it's a little bit safer to in terms of like getting prepped out. Um, yeah, and I think it depends, right? Like if your negative is going to be just here's like a moderate to good, in terms of strength, reason why secession is bad, then like yeah, you should probably have a good number in the bank. But if you have like some big conceptual answers all negative, then I think it's okay. Use that round around. Let's see. Annabelle say, okay, best neg case, stability is super good. It'll also be common. I think it's not necessarily bad that it's common. You just have to do a good job with it. Other things that I think will make for good neg cases. Um, conceptually, maybe I think maybe the way you set it up is accept that like secession is conceptually okay, right? Like yeah, maybe people do have a right to secede, but here's what happens like in all scenarios where they do. And it wouldn't be the worst thing in the world to like have a couple tiers, right? Like either they try to secede and they get quashed by their government and people die, they do secede, that government fails, people die. So just be like a total like total doomsday on a world after secession, because that can function as one of those answers all things, where no matter how the AF is approaching the issue of secession, you say that like on literally every level it's problematic. So you're covering your bases. But I don't know, like my neg argument last year that I thought was like one of the best things that I ever came up with was something that I came up with on my own. Not using briefs and just like brainstorming the topic. So if you come up with something that's unique or creative, then like don't be afraid to take it and run with it, even if you feel like it's not conventional or it might be hard to digest. Like if you love it, then like you should go with it. You want to take the next one?
Sure. So for the devolution, okay, so the next one is, do you think the Devolution Act or Act can take out the power sharing or reform counterplans? So I think that this is really reliant on the definitions that you read of secession, because some people could say that secession means devolution, um, and some people could say that it means different things. So I think it just pretty much just turns into a definitions debate at that point. If you make the argument that secession means an entirely new like country or area, then that would mean that it probably wouldn't take it out, I don't think, because the counterplans would be able to solve externally. Um, but if it means the same thing, then it definitely would take it out. Um, Jonathan can probably expand on this because I don't really understand the devolution much, but I think that probably it wouldn't unless you define it in a very specific way.
Yeah, I wouldn't say it takes them out entirely, just because like the neg probably if you're reading a power sharing neg, then I think like a CP, then I think the smart thing to do would be also read the backlash DA. So like it's better for them to just like hand it out, you know. And the backlash DA gets triggered when conversations about secessions are brought up. It doesn't even need secession, right? So that's why I think the devolution app isn't a full takeout of that. But it's definitely mitigatory. Like it's a good idea. And I just think the devolution app is a good idea. Because you get to farm some of those impacts from the power sharing CP. It just settles the debate down to like how will the government respond? I think that could be a winning battle for the app. You just have to do that warranting. And it says, is it bad to use examples during your constructive? In local debates are used a lot. In higher level debates, that hasn't really been the case. Is it bad to do more than one contention on the neg? Locally, please. Okay. No, definitely not bad to use examples during your constructive, but don't make a case out of the examples, right? Um, so you want your case material to have like a narrative, right? A story, something that's super clear. And then you want to integrate examples in that to give a backbone to that story, right? Don't think of it as working outwards so much from the examples as you should think of it like using some examples at points to strengthen the argument, right? So if your argument isn't true as you're explaining it with no examples, then it might not be a great argument. Like unless you're like lunging for the util arguments, in which case it might be okay to pick specific areas of the world and be like, hey, in this very specific example, here's what's going to happen. Broadly speaking, though, example is good, just don't lean on them too much. And then there's no right number of contentions. There's probably a number where it becomes too many. And like understanding, by the way, just like an additional thing, like 95% you will not spread at the national tournament, like at all. Um, and with that in mind, like if you're used to reading lots of off case arguments or just like lots of arguments, like you're gonna have to abandon that pretty much for nationals. Um, but yeah, it's not bad to do more than one contention. Like I wouldn't advise doing more than two, just because you're not supposed to really spend more than 3.5, 4 minutes on the neg case. And I don't think you'd be very good at flushing out like a value structure and then three independent contentions in 3.5 to 4 minutes. So I think it'd probably be advisable to stay two. And then Chloe, if you want to take Oliver's question.
Yeah, definitely. So the question is, if I were to run impacts on the neg, like balkanization, ethnic conflicts, border, etc., how should I create the case where most literature is empirical analysis or history? Could I get called out for cherry picking, and how would you go about making an example-heavy case? So for the okay, so for the first question about how to create the case where most literature is empirical analysis or history, I would recommend just going to websites that are, in the sense circular, pretty heavy on empirical examples that say, oh, this is what happened in this case where someone tried to secede, and it ended up with backlash. There's a lot of that in the briefs. But yeah, find examples in the card, and you can like read it in the card in your first speech, and then you can expand on that and make that like maybe a 30, 45-second thing in your 2NR and just expand, be like, they conceded this one example, which proves this is going to happen. It's happened empirically, etc. And a question about if you were going to get called out for cherry picking. I mean, in lay rounds, I think like everyone says that you cherry pick, but that's kind of just what everyone does, so it's non-unique. Yes, you probably are cherry picking, but so are they. So it probably doesn't matter if someone says, "Oh, you're cherry picking examples." Make them provide a counterexample which proves that you're wrong, and then you can get into a debate about who's more right, rather than an example about how you cherry picked information without them giving a counterexample. Then, how do you go about making an example heavy case? I think just highlighting a lot of parts in the cards that say this is what happened in this circumstance, and not highlighting as much conceptual stuff. But yeah, so less conceptual stuff and more stuff about specific instances.
Yeah, can't emphasize like anymore what Chloe said. Like totally, like absolute bars. Like everybody's cherry picking. Like yeah, you're cherry picking, but so are they. Like totally 100% true. Um, I think if you're concerned about that, the way to get around it is know the counter examples, right? So if you're going to talk about situations where there's backlash, look into the situations on the app where there is positive change, find problems with them. That way, when they try to like ambush you and cross, and they're like, okay, like I understand your example, but what about Quebec, right? You can be like, oh, like Quebec, a place where there's still in like crazy militarization and French speaking people on average are still making less money, whatever, right? And you're the one who's prepared, right? Because a lot of this is looking to the judges like the one who knows more about the topic. And so I think if you do a good job getting ahead of somebody calling you out for cherry picking, it can actually be really good bait that sets you up to like end the round right there. And then is it more advisable to super prep out one half but have different negs to switch to? In my opinion, like, okay, I think definitely if you're gonna have dexterity on one side, it should be the neg. In my opinion, I would probably have one on both sides, unless you have a big team that you can prep with, and or you just like feel like you have the time and ability to do that. But like, yeah, if you have to pick one side to spread them out and one side to just do one, and that's like important to you, then yeah, one half and different eggs, I think. Um,
Okay,
and then
so
Chloe, go ahead.
for drills to become a better speaker on the lay, I think that I would recommend giving speeches without a doc, or like 2NRs and 1ARs, everything like that, without a doc, just trying to be convincing. There's also a lot of drills that you can do that are like if you say a filler word, then you have to restart, or something similar to that. I think Johnathan probably knows more about this than me because I'm not really a lay debater that much. But I think generally just try to make yourself as clear as possible and try to give examples while not looking at your computer or your phone.
Yeah, it's like that's my favorite drill. We do it all the time. We have like a bell, and people will give a speech, and as they're going through, if they say like there's a long pause, anything that resembles a filler word, we hit the bell and they have to restart. Um, and sometimes they don't have to restart, right? So we'll just hit the bell and it'll be like a loud disruption. So create the negative association with stumbling. But another really good speaking drill, in my opinion, is I don't know if you've seen this, but like they have like slideshows with just a bunch of like goofy photos, or like hard like things that are hard to explain. And so what we'll do at our club is just put that slideshow up and click through it, and whoever's up there speaking has to on the fly start to like explain what's going on with those slides. And so it's just about building a reputation with the judge as you, the reputable person. And so I think if you're not a good speaker on the lay, you can avoid that, or you can avoid that being super problematic by just being more prepared and more knowledgeable. But if you are looking for better drills, like those are a couple I'd suggest. Where is it best to look for empirics? Any specific tips to get warrants and empirics for specific examples? Um, well, Lincoln, the first thing I'd ask is do you have any briefs?
Yeah, I have all three out right now.
Okay. So those are really good jumping off points. I think if you're looking for empirics, like what I would do is you can even use GPT for this if you feel like it. Just generate a long list of instances where secession was either on the table or it happened. Know all the examples that could come up, and then look into them individually. I don't know. I'm not sure I have a good answer as to, like, where is it best to look, like what websites or whatever. But in terms of researching tips, like that's what I would do. Like, get your context, and then as your mind forms arguments based on, like, however many years you've been in debate or however long you've been doing this, like you can start to use that information to fill in those arguments with good context. That's my advice. And then Quinn, like half of it.
Yeah, I think like depending on the AF, honestly, if the AF is terrible, you can probably devote less time to it, or more, honestly. But you can kind of get a feel for it also depending on the judge, because some judges won't see time that's spent refuting the AF as time developing independent offense, and some won't see independent offense as like something external to Vaughn. So if you prove the AF wrong, then you automatically will win. So yeah, it just depends on the judge. I think probably about 3 minutes, or even or even 4 or 2, probably 2 to 4 minutes.
My rule at nationals last year was I would spend like, so my thought process was I had like one stand, like an AF and a neg, like my regular one, and then I had like tech AF and tech neg, and those for rounds where I knew that I was like dealing with not parent judges or not uber traditional judges. And so in those rounds I spent minimal time on my case material. Obviously the AF is always going to be 6 minutes, right? But I would just fit more things into that 6 minutes. And for the neg, my tech neg was like 3 minutes. Like in the nationals final round, my neg was about 3 minutes, because I want to put lots of responses on the flow onto the AF for those rounds. So if you can condense it and you think that'd be appropriate for the panel, do it. But yeah, like I would say never outside of the 3 to 4 minute range. Could I possibly debate you as practice, Jonathan? I mean, I'm actually not competing on this topic, so I don't have any prep for it. But yeah, my Instagram is tagged on the equality and forensics thing. So if you wanna, and I can put it in the chat too when we're all done. Um, Anybody here obviously is welcome to, but all versus US, you're welcome to DM me and maybe we could set something else up. Sure.
Yeah, same with me. I mean, especially for circuit rounds as well. If you want to get any practice with like having a round in front of a circuit judge or a flow judge, I'm down for that, or even a lay round too. Yeah, so feel free to message me as well. How does prep time work? Oh, prep time, you get, I don't know if it's 4 or 5 minutes at nationals. I think it's 4. Um, but
Sure.
basically, okay, yeah, 4. So you get 4 minutes to use at any time in the round that you want to. Obviously, don't use it before your first speech. Or, I mean, if you're negative, then you can, but if you're affirmative, then there's no point. But what the negative tends to do is in lay rounds, or generally they can use 2 minutes before their first speech and 2 minutes before their second speech. In circuit rounds, people usually just use 4 minutes before their second speech and 0 minutes before their first speech. I think that a nice mix is 1 minute before your first negative constructive, and 2 minutes and 3 minutes before your second negative constructive. For the affirmative, I think a 2-2 split is pretty good. But yeah, that's pretty much how it works.
Yeah, and I think the reason, so in finals, there's like a large man wearing a rainbow suit, who like sits sort of on the panel with the judges so you can see him. And like the rule is always that, like, if you are not, like, if it's your turn to speak and you're not speaking, your prep time is running. And that's like unique to finals. For the most part, it works like every other round you ever had. It's just in finals they don't want like the kind of like awkward disruption of asking for prep time. So they just assume you're taking prep time. And then, oh, sorry, hold on 1 second.
Okay, I can take the next question. So I don't know what his theory round was last year, but I tend to run into theory a lot in circuit debate. And I think a lot of common, I don't think that you're probably not going to need to prep theory, to be completely honest. Maybe disclosure theory is the main one that you should worry about, but even that I don't think is very likely. Disclosure theory just says you have to disclose the AF 30 minutes before the round, or disclose your arguments on the wiki. Some common responses to that are just argument generation. If it's good for someone to think on their feet to respond to something and not just read off the doc. Argument generation, critical thinking skills, quick thinking skills. And I think also just like the argument that we're at, like a lay national tournament. This is probably not going to be something that comes up, but like, it's a lay tournament. People don't usually have to disclose in lay. So yeah, I don't think that you need to prep theory shells. And probably not T shells either, unless someone's blatantly non typical. And in that case, you can probably just make an intuitive argument, and a lot of the lay judges would understand it. Okay, Jonathan, you're
Specifically,
back.
yeah, specifically the theory round that I had. I read disclosure. But and this was like really tough because again, you can't see their speaker before, and they're like so like open case is impossible to use. Um, but I just like I got in the round and I waited for all the judges to get there, and I asked the dude on the AF like, "Yo, are you gonna send the AF? Like, will you disclose the AF? I think like word for word." And he's like, "No, I don't do that." And I was like, "Okay." And so I just cut down my neg a little bit, and then I read like 45 seconds to a minute, just like they chose not to disclose. That's bad for evidence ethics. Drop the debater, or like here's why it's whatever, drop the debater. And I'm not really like I've probably had a total of 10 theory rounds ever. So it's not maybe even less than that, and it's like not like a great skill of mine. So it's just something that I did. And it ended up being that like he didn't know what to do with it. And he spent like almost all of the time in his next speech on the theory round, totally dropped everything on the substantive level of the debate, and just like lost on both levels. And that was in like octafinals or something. Like there were 14 people left at the time. So yeah, that was how I again, you don't really need to. I would say definitely you don't need to prep theory shells. Maybe be familiar with what a couple shells look like and know what you would say to them. But it shouldn't be high on your list of priorities because nobody that I hit even thought about reading theory shell. A lay round is just like lay refers to layman. So just imagine you're having the round in front of a parent. Like, that's what it means. So a lay round is something where you're not as concerned with you don't want to use jargon, right? Keeping up with the flow is not as important. Maintaining a consistent narrative that's easy to understand is important. Being a compelling speaker is important. Sounding like you know what you're talking about is important. Standing up straight is important, right? Um, so it's just like a little more superficial, a little less in depth because the people that are listening are not as educated on debate or the topic. That's basically what it means. And then Chloe, if you want to take the last one.
Okay. When it comes to offense on the stability decide, is it arguable that the new government's created maximize oppression, which loses after offense? Which population would be preferable to prioritize in terms of the desata? Would you go for? Okay, this is an excellent question. So, and I think that this is the last question that we're going to take, just because I've got to go back to my hotel. But so for the question about offense on the stability decide, the argument that secession could create potentially authoritarian regimes, etc., would be an argument that we would say outweighs the rest of democracy. Because first of all, or like if we're on the negative, we'd say that. Because first of all, so if the government were to allow secession, it might not just be one like small area that secedes. It could just end up being a ton of different areas, which could lead to just a ton of different authoritarian regimes, which all oppress minorities, and then like a lot of people are unhappy, a lot of people die, stuff like that. And we would say that that would outweigh. So, secondly, is that we would say that in the democracy, it would be a worse democracy because of that, because there would be other areas where it's allowed to do this and where the government is not able to intervene. So you would just say that it would maximize oppression, especially in a lay round. Just the argument that that more oppression is created in authoritarian regimes is like pretty convincing. Just that secession will lead to like anarchy or like some other form of government that's not democracy, which is worse. And you don't even really have to weigh that against the rest of democracy, because in the status quo, that wouldn't be happening in the first place. So you would just say that anything that's bad that's happening as a result of the affirmative plan would be just bad intrinsically.
Yeah,
Okay,
couldn't agree more. I also think that's a good strategy, Lincoln, to just say like we don't like seceded governments are likely to be bad, and that outweighs. Like I think that's the right response.
Okay, yeah, just to be like super clear on this, just because that was a lot really quickly. So with this contention, I was thinking it's like two subpoints. One, you worsen the quality of life for the people who don't secede in the former country. Two, you worsen the quality of life for the people in the newly created territory because the government's less legitimate. They have less power to actually protect the rights of that new population.
Yes, exactly. But mainly the second one about how in the new
Yeah,
territory it will be worse. Yeah.
agreed. I think the first one is a little like it just seems like kind of unnecessary and hard to get to. But the second one I think is super compelling. Like the million people in Catalonia or whatever are now being controlled by like a government with no checks and balances, and that all has the same shared ideas, which is like two keys to authoritarianism.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you guys all for coming. This was, I think, really like informative. And yeah, also feel free to like DM me any questions. Johnathan just put our Instagrams in the chat. So yeah, if you have any questions, then just feel free to DM either of us. I'm always happy to do a round or do like a lecture or anything like that on anything that anyone's confused about. So yeah, thank you guys.
Yep, same here. Appreciate y'all for coming out.